Today, as I sit trembling under 3 layers of wool blankets, a ceramic mug in my hands and a heater humming in the background, I wonder, what if I had lived 3,000 years ago? No blankets, no double-glazed windows, no Netflix, no hot soup arriving at your doorstep after a few taps on your phone. Back then, cold wasn't just something you felt and complained about. You lived with it, you fought it, and sometimes you lost to it. For the people of the ancient world, winter wasn't merely a season, it was a trial. If you woke up one morning and your body was still breathing, it meant the gods had forgiven you for another day. But many weren't forgiven, because winter loved to punish. It was silent, slow, and it didn't bite. It gnawed its way into your very bones. Every survival skill humanity developed, shelter, warmth, food, solidarity, was born out of a long, bitter struggle with this ancient enemy. And we, the radiator-heated grandchildren of modern times, have forgotten this. But today, we'll remember. We'll go back to those first winters, when there was no fire, when furs clung to skin like a second layer, when food was sacred. And we'll say not just, so this is what cold felt like, but this is what it meant to be human. Because this is not just a story of survival. It is a cold journey back to the roots we've forgotten. Waking up in an ancient home usually meant starting your day being slapped by the wind. These structures were not architectural marvels. They were more like the final compromise of a long negotiation with the elements. Walls were mostly a mix of mud, stone, and straw. No plaster, no insulation, and often, the top part of the door was left open. The wind wasn't a messenger of the gods, it was practically the fifth member of the household. Construction varied by region. In Egypt, thick stone walls could carry the sun's heat into the night, but when humidity met cold, the interior turned into a kind of tomb-like chill. In Mesopotamia, there were mud brick homes, ovens by day, freezers by night. In Anatolia, some communities were carved into the earth. Good for hot summers, but in winter, even breathing took effort. For the wealthy, it was slightly different. Roman villas had luxuries like the hypocaust, an underfloor heating system. But that was a privilege of the elite, not the people. Most slept on stone floors, used sacks of straw for pillows, and let the wind seeping through the walls chill their organs as they slept.
Snow!
Windows? They were dreams reserved for the rich. Glass was expensive, and usually greenish and blurry. So even if you had one, you couldn't really see outside. You only knew where the cold was coming in. The walls didn't protect you from the outside. They simply marked the line where you could say, "At least I didn't die." But even inside that line, life wasn't easy. Because once you entered, a new enemy awaited: heat. And this is where it all begins. You had to find fire. But making it, keeping it, sharing it, that was an entirely different battle. In ancient times, fire wasn't just warmth. It was the sole source of survival, food, light, and sometimes even hope. But starting a fire wasn't a matter of pressing a button. It began with damp twigs, stones, and sometimes prayers. And even if you managed to light it, someone had to stay awake to guard it through the night. One moment of neglect meant bodies shivering until dawn and regretful prayers whispered to the gods. There was no central fireplace. Usually, a pit was dug into the ground where a small hearth burned. People would gather around, inhaling the smoke directly to keep warm. Chimneys were a luxury. Most homes had smoke holes meant to keep the air out. So being indoors wasn't about comfort. It was a struggle against the smoke. Another heating strategy was animals. Yes, literally living under the same roof as goats and sheep. Their body heat provided crucial warmth during the night. But this heat sharing came at a cost. Sweat, manure, lice, odor, noise. A warm night, in truth, was just another name for a beastly one. In wealthier societies, heated stones were commonly used like blankets. Sometimes, hot ashes were placed into bronze pots and set at the foot of the bed. At times, hot bricks were strapped under one's shirt. And for some, it wasn't the fire itself, but its preserved form. An ember pouch, a warm stone, an incense vessel that saved lives. But despite all this effort, Waking up each morning didn't feel like being reborn. It felt like surviving all over again. And let's say your body did warm up a little. At that moment, when you leaned against the cold stone wall to keep the chill out, you'd realize it wasn't your skin. It was your soul that was freezing. That's why fire alone wasn't enough. You needed another layer over your body. So what did the people of the ancient world wear? Let's move on. In the ancient world, clothing was not about style, it was about defense. The first rule of protection against the cold was clear. Dress in layers, in other words, wrap yourself up quite literally. But it wasn't just about not freezing. It was also about making do with what you had. Because producing clothes wasn't easy. Every piece was valuable, and often passed down through generations. You couldn't talk about fashion before you made sure you wouldn't freeze. The base layer was usually linen or woolen undergarments. This layer, directly touching the skin, provided warmth and protected the body from the irritation caused by rougher fabrics on top. Over it came tunics woven from sheep's wool, cloaks, or thick felted coverings. But this thing we call wool should not be confused with today's soft sweaters. Ancient wool was thick, coarse, and itchy. It did warm you, but it also drove you mad. Primitive boots made from animal hide were worn on the feet. Some were stuffed with straw from the leg opening because what they called insulation was sometimes just dried grass. Gloves were rare, but hands had to be kept warm because if your hands froze, you couldn't start a fire. Some communities wrapped warm stones in cloth and carried them in their palms, a kind of ancient hand warmer. Class differences made themselves known here as well. The rich wore fur, fox, Moses, sable, squirrel, rabbit. The rarer it was, the more prestigious. In fact, in some societies, such furs were banned for commoners, because even warmth could be a matter of class. The poor wrapped themselves in goat hides or rough textiles they wove themselves. And more often than not, what was tucked between those layers wasn't just heat, but hope. Because in some winters, what warmed you wasn't the clothing. It was the feeling of still being alive. But warm clothing couldn't fill your stomach, and in a cold world, an empty belly was the greatest enemy. In the ancient world, winter was often summed up in a single word: stockpile. Because when nature fell asleep, the soil went silent, trees quieted down, and herbs vanished. Whatever you had at that moment, that's what would carry you through the winter. And if you hadn't planned well, winter wasn't just a hard season, it was your last season. The harvest didn't begin in summer but in early spring, because every single day mattered when trying to produce enough to store. Grains dried in sunlight were packed into clay pots or jars and stored in the shade. Sometimes embers were placed inside these jars and sealed with clay to keep air out, because one single pest could mean the end of an entire winter. Meat was almost sacred. Before being consumed, it was dried, salted, smoked. Sometimes, a single bitterly cold day meant the end of an animal, but the hope of a family. The sacrificed animal would be preserved as food for days, even weeks. In some regions, bones were boiled, marrow extracted, and even the leftover cartilage turned into soup. Nothing was wasted, because waste was equivalent to hunger. Dairy was another matter. Milk collected during the summer months was stored in the form of yogurt, cheese, sour milk, or salty curds. In some areas, the whey resulting from curdled milk was used like a kind of meat brine. This wasn't just a recipe, it was a survival tactic. Sweets, dried fruits from summer, figs, dates, but these were usually reserved for children or the sick, because energy had to be directed where it was most needed. And of course, water. Those who lived near rivers were lucky, but what if they froze? Ancient people would melt snow to make it drinkable. Sometimes, earthenware pots filled with snow were placed beside the fire and left to thaw slowly. This wasn't just to quench thirst, it was wisdom for survival. But no matter how prepared you were, some winters didn't just feel cold, they felt cruel. And in those times, stockpiles weren't enough, because there was nothing left to stockpile. Now I'm taking you into the coldest, hungriest pages of history. You've wrapped your body in layers of hide, Your fire is burning, there are dried figs in the jars, and you're sleeping side by side with a goat. But what about the mind? Cold doesn't just freeze the body, it freezes the soul. And ancient people knew this well. That's why winter wasn't just about survival. It was about protecting the mind. During those long nights when the fields lay still and the sky turned gray, people would gather to avoid being alone. Around the fire in the center, despite the smoke stinging their throats, stories were told. These stories were sometimes about the gods, sometimes about ancestors, and sometimes about the storyteller's own fears. Because words were warmth. There were also games. In ancient Greece, dice-like games were played with small bone pieces called astragaloi, while in Mesopotamia, strategy games were played with wooden stones. It wasn't just for fun, it was an effort to make time pass. In some societies, children would run on the snow, build sculptures from ice, and mothers would sew toys from old fabric, crafting imaginary worlds indoors. The Vikings would glide over the ice with skates made of bone. But this joy wasn't joy in the modern sense, it was another form of resistance. Rituals were never absent. Prayers said according to the moon's cycle, symbolic fires lit for the abundance of the new year, drinks smoked to ward off disease, the last scraps of food offered to the gods to endure poverty. When the mind couldn't hold on, belief stepped in. And maybe this was the greatest form of entertainment in the ancient world, holding on to hope in the midst of darkness. Winter would pass, it always did. But that didn't make it easy, because resisting the cold wasn't just about staying alive, it was about staying human. Today, as we prepare for winter, we check our radiators, stock up on canned goods from the supermarket, and plug in our electric blankets. But thousands of years ago, those same preparations were much quieter, much heavier, and far more sacred. Because back then, winter wasn't a season, it was a test. Ancient people tried to survive inside stone walls, shoulder to shoulder with animals, with fire-warmed stones and stories kneaded with hope. For them, warmth didn't come directly from the sun. It came from the community, from fire, from unity. And today, in this age where we've made everything easier, maybe we've forgotten the most important thing. The way to endure the cold is not just through technology, but through memory. These stories are as old as the bones buried beneath the soil, but if you're watching this video, it means those roots still live. If you want to rediscover the wisdom of the past, remember what's been forgotten, and relearn humanity's ancient relationship with nature, time, and the gods, you're in the right place. Subscribe to Primordia, because here the past isn't just told, it's lived again.